All right, see some folks trickling in. Welcome. We'll just get started in a few minutes. Let more people have some time to get into their Zoom. All right, so we'll still give people some time to get into their Zooms, but for now, let me just get started with a couple of introductions. Let's see, are we muted? So let's see, real quick to answer the question in the chat. If you move your mouse to the bottom of your screen, the bottom Zoom menu should pop up. And I believe your mute button will be at the very bottom left-hand corner, although for the Zoom purposes, we have everyone muted once they come in, just because we'll be using the chat to answer any questions. So not to worry about that. As long as you can hear us, that's all we want. And then later on, we'll have a chance for questions from Jane. So let's see. Let me get this started. Well, first, I want to say welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name's Gianna. I'm one of the reference librarians here at the Chelmsford Public Library. Just to let you know, our art programming is now going to be art on Thursdays in 2023. It was on Tuesdays. We're just shifting it to another day during the week. Just so that everyone's aware, the next art on Thursdays night is going to be on Thursday, February 23rd, and it's going to be on the brief and brilliant career of Jean-Michel Basquiat. So please tune into that in the next coming weeks. All right. So, I'll be getting to that soon. Where can we see part one? So yes, let me start with introductions and we'll get into that. So let's see. So tonight we have Jane O'Neill. She's the founder of Culturally Curious, an arts education consulting firm specializing in art appreciation programs. She curates and delivers programs throughout New England and beyond. O'Neill holds a master's in art history from Boston University and a master's in education from Harvard University. Born and raised in New Hampshire, she has worked at some of the state's most esteemed cultural institutions, including the League of New Hampshire Craftsmen, where she served as executive director, and the Carrier Museum of Art, where she held the role of senior educator. Jane has also taught at the college level for more than a decade, most recently at Southern New Hampshire University. For more information, visit iamculturallycurious.com. Tonight, she will present The Secret Stories Behind Art's Most Iconic Works, Part 2. From Starry Night to the Nighthawks, there are some images that are so ubiquitous in our culture that we have stopped looking at them closely. This program delves into these iconic works and shares the secret stories behind their creation and reception. Edward Hopper, Nighthawks Detail, 1942, Art Institute of Chicago. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. So to answer your question about part one, our programming librarian, Jessica, will be sending an email tomorrow at some point, so keep an eye out in your emails. She'll be sending out the recording of tonight's program as well as the recording from part one. So if you missed that, you'll get that tomorrow. So without further ado, I'm going to shift over to Jane and she'll get us started.
Thank you so much, Gianna. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in tonight, for spending your evening with us. I am so honored to have your time and your ear, and we're going to have a lot of fun over the next hour, sort of delving into these works, digging into their past, and sharing these sometimes salacious secrets that go along with them. So these will probably all be paintings that you've seen before, but now hopefully you'll be able to see them in a new way. So we will be getting into the birth of Venus that I have on the screen here in just a little bit. I wanted to start off, especially for those that didn't see part one yet, just with the quick reminder about this term iconic, because it really is an art history term. The word icon refers to specific kinds of art that were produced towards the end of the Gothic era. These were emphatically flat images, like the one that you see over here on the left, and they were usually depictions of the Madonna and Child or different saints, typically with a flat golden background. And even though they weren't meant to look like an illusion of an actual person, they did function as stand-ins for those saints, and they were objects that were literally worshipped and revered. Of course, Andy Warhol turns that all on its head by the 1960s by putting in celebrities and pop culture figures into an iconic status, literally over here with Marilyn on gold, or Golden Marilyn from the early 1960s. So when we think about iconic works of art today, they are things that we sort of revere. They're also exceptional works of art that are noted for being sort of the best of their type. They also help us make sense out of the world around us. And I think you'll see that as we move through the material tonight. There's a lot of parodies that I've slipped into the program, and you'll see, oh yeah, by placing those characters in the same composition as this famous work of art, I understand the dynamics between those characters in a new way. So lots to delve into. I'm going to try and circle back to most of the questions tonight at the end, unless there's something burning and urgent that Gianna steps in to notify me about. So let's get started with just an understanding in terms of how we'll spend this next hour together. For those of you that were here for part one, we covered famous faces and figures already, as well as intriguing couples. And so tonight, what we'll be focusing on is gods and heroes and imagined spaces. Tons to cover here. Okay. So let's get started with our gods and heroes. And we're going to circle right back to Botticelli's famous Birth of Venus, which is painted in the early 1480s. This is a painting that's in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. Maybe some of you have visited it and seen it in person. It's an oil on canvas, which was somewhat unusual for the times, and it's huge. It's roughly 6 feet tall by about 9 feet wide. And the subject matter here was very unusual for its time. It's a mythological subject matter, of course, Venus being the goddess of love, and it's a full-length female nude. Artists really weren't painting anything like this, and they hadn't been painting anything like this for roughly 1,500 years, going back to classical antiquity. And you might be scratching your head and thinking, sure, there are plenty of female nudes in between that time period, in those 1,500 years. And for the most part, the nudes that you do see look a lot like this. Over here on the left is a fresco painting by an early Italian Renaissance artist named Masaccio. This dates to about 1425, so almost 50 years before Botticelli's Birth of Venus. And in this little detail that we see here, we see Adam and Eve being expelled from the Garden of Eden by this angel with a sword. And of course, Eve is naked. This is how we identify her in art for the most part. But look at the pain on her face, and look at how she's really struggling to hide her nudity here. And in some ways, I always sort of thought of the pain as being associated with the shame of her nude body. Now, our Venus over here on the right, looking so lovely, is in a very similar pose. But you'll notice, even though she's attempting to cover herself, she's not successful in that endeavor. And that is entirely the point. We'll be delving into that. So what makes the Birth of Venus so outstanding, so exceptional, is that this was really the first painting that was done for nearly 1,500 years that was celebrating sensuality, sex itself, beauty in this new way. It's believed that this painting was probably done as a wedding present. What a wedding present, right? And it was probably commissioned by the famous Medici family, someone in the famous Medici family, because this grove of trees over here is actually an orange grove, and the orange was the symbol of the Medici because of its close association with medicinal properties. All right, so let's zoom in for a second on this full-length female nude and what makes her really intriguing and exceptional for the time period. Now, I think that this gorgeous woman here sort of functions as a stand-in for beauty for us even today. She's just a symbol for beauty. She's a shorthand for beauty. But I think the more that you look at her, the stranger she looks. So let's start off with her head and her neck here. She's got this impossibly long giraffe-like neck, and then her head is sort of hinged in a strange angle from that neck. The neck goes off in this direction, the head tilts in this direction, and when we compare sort of the width of the head versus the neck seems a little bit maybe larger than it could be or should be. If we move down from there, notice how tiny her shoulders are and that they look absolutely collapsed. She really has no shoulders here. She's got a long torso, even longer arms, and impossibly long hair. I mean, this is hair that's never been cut. Botticelli was living at a time where hair functioned also as this stand-in, the symbol or signifier of sensuality. So the more hair, the better. The more elaborate the hairstyle, the better. I always imagine him painting alongside like a hairstylist who could go in and sort of do touch-ups. But if we move even further down her body, we can see that she's standing in what art historians call a contrapposto stance. So there's this slight shift of the hips, and we have one leg at work and one leg at rest. So all of her weight is on one leg, and the other leg is just kind of at rest, at ease. This is a natural way that people stand. And this is something that Renaissance era artists were trying to explore, taking the tip from classical antiquity. We'll sort of see how Botticelli gets it right and a little bit wrong here. So let's go to the classical past for just a moment, because this pose that Botticelli's Venus has adopted here comes directly from the classical past by way of Masaccio to Botticelli here tonight. So we have sculptures going back 1500 years and more with Venus types or actual Venuses in this exact same pose that Botticelli chooses over here. And we see once again, this Venus is not really successful in covering herself up. So if we imagine that an artwork like this was presumably made by a male artist for a male audience, the lack of success in covering up your private parts is part of the delight here. As a male viewer or even voyeur, I mean, that's really what this sculpture does for us. You can walk all the way around and gaze at this nude woman's body. You don't have that quite the same luxury with Botticelli's Venus because she's two dimensions, but we still get to glimpse the goods, basically. So it's a very sensual, it's an inviting image here that draws us in with a little bit of a peep show. I mean, who refers to Botticelli as giving us peep shows, but I'll put it out there tonight. It's a little bit of a peep show. The other sort of strange lean to her body here, I think actually comes from something more recent, something like Gothic sculpture. And we can see a Gothic sculpture over here on the left that was carved out of an ivory tusk. So it already has this sort of slant, this lean to it. And it functions really well because with the Madonna and child here, she kind of has to shift her hips in order to balance that child. Notice again, just how long her neck is and how her whole body sort of creates this arc in this way. And I think you can sort of see a similar line with the body of our Venus painted by Botticelli. So let's fill out the rest of the cast of characters. And it really does feel like a cast because there's something about this painting where the figures are so large. They're so close to the picture plane itself. They're on a shallow stage setting and they are arranged for us to be able to easily kind of piece together what's happening here. Having said that, art historians are still debating to this day exactly what is unfolding here. And I will just well, in brief, we have the notion that the goddess of love, this gorgeous creature at the center, was born fully formed of the sea foam, I should say. She's on this giant shell and she is being blown to the shore, where this other female figure is bringing a floral cloak in order to cover her. So there's, once again, another suggestion of modesty, even though it's not actually covering anything. Of course, these figures over here on the left are doing that important work of blowing this giant clamshell towards the shore. Now, I want to just briefly note how a lot of the elements of this picture sort of come from Botticelli's experience as a religious painter. He was painting altarpieces for most of his career, depictions of the Madonna and the Child arranged with angels and saints in varying orders. This is a particularly stunning example of one of his altarpieces, and you can see it's really elaborate in terms of the clothes, the architecture that encircles them. You'll notice that there's this little architectural niche that the Madonna and Child are sitting in, and that there's actually a clamshell over her head. In some ways, he's taken this beautiful Madonna, who has that same kind of strangely hinged neck, and almost flipped her around, stripped her down, and is presenting her here as something to be desired. I think another element from religious painting that he kind of stole or twisted around and incorporated in his mythological painting is a floating winged figure. Over here on the left, we have just a detail of one of Botticelli's Annunciation scenes, one of his depictions of the angel Gabriel coming to the Virgin Mary to announce that she's divinely pregnant. Now, in this case, the news of this divine pregnancy is actually coming from beyond the angel, sort of the voice of God booming through this portal here, but it's kind of coming through the angel, and these straight lines, this message, are being portrayed through his mouth. We notice he's got these gorgeous wings and he's hovering above the ground. We see something really similar with the birth of Venus here too. We've got a figure here that is traditionally interpreted as a Zephyr figure. He's a god of the wind. He's got similarly flowing hair. And in this case, instead of the word of God coming through his lips, he's got these big puffy cheeks and the wind is coming from his mouth. He's got some loose drapery here and an additional figure who is understood to be like a lesser goddess of the wind, oftentimes named Aura. And she's helping to blow this goddess to the shoreline. But also you'll notice that there are all these flowers in the air. So all of this wind that they're creating is also blowing these roses along with the Venus here. Now, our last character is this figure over here, and believe it or not, art historians are still debating to this day whether or not she is a personification of spring or summer. I would say in most cases, it hardly matters to the average person, but they get really into what kinds of flowers are around her middle section here and on her dress and on this mantle that she's going to use to cover up the Virgin. Now, beyond this, we've got some real interesting stylization. Notice how the waves are pretty uniform, the tree trunks are pretty uniform. Botticelli is really just focusing our eye and attention on the beauty of these figures. Notice too that this figure here has a really elaborate hairdo. Once again, that stylist is right there and she's on point. The last element here that I wanted to share with you when it comes to Botticelli and the birth of Venus is this hard line that he uses to define the elements of the figure and the elements of her body. He's using a black line to describe her nostrils, the outline of her eyes, her chin here. And just a few decades later, we're going to have somebody like Leonardo da Vinci come in who's not using a hard black line to describe anything. Instead, he's using this kind of smudgy shadowing, which makes this figure appear much more three-dimensional. But you couldn't get to Leonardo da Vinci from let's say the Gothic era, without going through Botticelli first. Botticelli is introducing to us this new focus on the human form and on beauty and sensuality, skin and flesh. And so without Botticelli, we would have never gotten to the famous Mona Lisa. Now, Mona Lisa is going to serve as a segue for us. She is, of course, not a god or a hero, but his other major work, Leonardo da Vinci's other major famous work, the depiction of the Last Supper, is certainly a rendering of a god, or at least the son of God, right? So everybody's seen this painting before. We all know that it was painted in the final years of the 1400s. And we know that this was done on a wall inside a dining hall that was used by monks. It was at a monastery. So you can imagine being a monk, eating silently and taking in this scene. Now, this is a very dramatic scene. This is the moment Leonardo da Vinci decided to paint the moment where Jesus says to his disciples, "One of you is about to betray me." And notice how there's like this ripple of emotion and really sort of carefully observed human behavior that is rendered here in response to this news. This is high drama. This is like Bravo TV, Real Housewives flipping tables kind of drama. And just imagine being one of those monks, sort of meditating on this issue or image for years as you eat silently. Now, in the midst of this chaos, Leonardo da Vinci has given us a very rational space that we can sort of make sense out of. He's rendered the Last Supper in this interior space, and the perspectival lines of this interior famously converge at the head of Jesus. So we know just from the architecture here that he is important. Now, one of the revolutionary things that da Vinci did was he decided to do away with halos, but there is a little arch over this doorway beyond Jesus that kind of functions as a very subtle halo. There were a number of revolutionary things that he did with this work, but I want to sort of cut away to the idea of who are each of these characters. And what's most important to me, at least I remember the first time I ever saw this painting, was where's Judas? Which figure here is Judas? If one of them is about to betray Jesus, how can you tell who is it? Because everybody sort of seems to be, pleading their innocence here. So if you don't remember right off the bat, let me tell you that artists used to make it really easy for you. Other artists from the 1400s, who were Leonardo da Vinci's predecessors, created these works that da Vinci himself was familiar with and studied from. And these depictions of the Last Supper made it so easy to find who was going to betray Jesus. They literally put Judas on the other side of the table. I find it kind of humorous every time I look at it, because who among us has ever been to a dinner party where everyone but one person sits on one side of the table? Now, you'll notice that there are some gestures that are pretty consistent from one painting to the next, even to da Vinci's painting. But one thing that we don't see in da Vinci's painting, along with Judas being on the wrong side of the table, is this element of a sleeping figure or a leaning figure on the table right next to Jesus. That is St. John. But what's really interesting is that in early sketches, Leonardo da Vinci was both playing with the idea of putting Judas across from Jesus, as you can see over here, and because of the way that biblical text was interpreted, there was this idea that John was like falling asleep at the Last Supper because he was leaning on Jesus's bosom. So da Vinci painted St. John with his head on, or at least sketched him with his head on the table. That doesn't make for great drama. So he ends up revising that. All right, so we go back to the Last Supper as it is today. Now, we know that he was revolutionary in terms of not using halos on these figures, but he was always experimental when it came to his works, especially with the materials. Like sometimes he would get off track with the project because he wanted to do new things. He wanted to innovate all the time. And the Last Supper was a fresco painting. It is a fresco painting, and it's huge. I should mention the square footage of this painting is roughly the size of like a studio apartment. It's 25 feet long. So here he is kind of getting off track with it. Now, when you paint a fresco, you are applying paint pigment directly onto wet plaster so that when the paint and the plaster dry, the painting becomes a permanent part of the wall. But Da Vinci's like, maybe there's a way to make these colors a little bit brighter. So he was integrating other materials in with those pigments. And they really sort of started to mess with the painting pretty early on. So when I tell you a little bit about how this painting has survived over the years, I think you're going to be pretty astonished. So within the space of a few decades, people started to see that the painting was really deteriorating and deteriorating quickly. It was surviving somehow the smoke and the steam from the adjacent kitchen, because remember, it's in a dining hall. But by the 1600s, there was a door cut into this painting. You can see that they removed Jesus's feet here. The following century, Napoleon's troops actually used this building as a stable. There were horses inside, and apparently the painting was in such bad condition that the troops made sort of a game of throwing bricks and manure at this painting. In the 1800s, there was a 15-day flood that affected this building, and this building just absorbed the moisture like a sponge, and a green mold grew across the painting. So by the time Henry James saw this painting in the late 19th century, early 20th century, he said that it was like essentially the saddest painting in history. People began to call it the Lost Supper. I mean, there was no hope for it. And you'd think by the time World War II rolls around that nobody's really thinking of it. Well, the people who were running this building, this property at the time, had the foresight to buttress up this wall where the painting was, because the building got bombed. The roof caved in, but yet the wall and the painting remained. This is that buttress wall right there. They actually used pillows and mattresses just to get your bearings. You notice that there's like an archway coming down the wall towards us in this picture, and that corresponds to this part of the painting or photograph over here. I love having photos with people looking at the image so you can get a sense of just how large these figures and how large the paintings are too. So by the 1970s, this was the state of the Last Supper. I mean, it was in such sorry shape. Now, the painting underwent a huge restoration. And luckily, there were some roughly contemporary copies that they could look to. So this is a copy that was done of Da Vinci's Last Supper about 25 years after he first painted it. This is in the collection of the Royal Academy of Arts in the UK. So it gives us a couple of really interesting clues here. First of all, we can see Jesus's feet. I know you're all dying to see that, right? But it spells out for us very clearly who Judas is, even though it's kind of hard to make that out in Da Vinci's painting today. You can see that he's got the bag of silver right there in his hand. A lot is made of the fact that he is knocked over the salt here too. I've heard a couple of different reasons as to what the significance of that is, that it might be a signal of his dishonesty or just his disrespect in general. So when it comes to the Last Supper, it really is miraculous that it's still here with us today, because it is really second to none in terms of composition and storytelling. Now we're going to transition away from this Renaissance master to another Renaissance master, and that is Michelangelo. And now we're going to see not the Son of God, but God himself, which is a pretty unusual move, almost a ballsy move for an artist to undertake. For the most part, artists kind of shy away from depictions of God. But in this case, Michelangelo gives us God in full force, and he looks like a pagan Zeus. He's got this long beard. He's super muscular. But when it comes to male bodies, Michelangelo always thinks the more muscles, the better. So this is just the detail from the Sistine Chapel ceiling, which was painted between 1508 and 1512. This particular section of the painting is about 9 feet tall and about twice that in terms of its length. So it's huge. And it was designed to be that way so that you could get a good sense of what was happening as you're standing about 70 feet underneath it on the floor inside the Sistine Chapel. Now, this is one of the most famous, one of the most iconic scenes of all time. We have the creation of man, the creation of Adam. Adam is sort of languishing here on this little patch of earth. He is all muscle. He looks like he could be an incredibly powerful figure, but here he has like no energy. It's almost as though he's nothing but muscle. He doesn't seem to have a brain, a soul, any sort of humanity here. It takes God sort of swooping in, and he is all energy. He's all zest. And it takes him swooping in to sort of convey all of everything that's still lacking here with Adam. And we get the sense that in this little inch of space between their fingers, there's like this electricity, there's this potential for everything that human beings can be. And we're on the edge of our seat. We can't wait to see it because God is promising so much in this incredible scene. So leaving those fingers in this kind of untouched moment is, I think, just great storytelling on the part of Michelangelo. And I've seen so many posters over the years too, of just the hands there and that in that moment just before they connect. So let's turn our attention back to God for a moment, because like I said, he is muscular, he's all powerful. It's a really unusual choice for Michelangelo to show him in like this short little tunic here, and we can see God's knees and his feet. It's strange. And there's this swooping drapery behind him, and we notice that there are all these little Cupid-like figures. The Italians call them putti. They aren't necessarily little gods of love, but they're often sort of like these kind of filler figures. And Michelangelo had a lot of filler figures on the Sistine Chapel ceiling. So it makes sense that he's kind of surrounded by these sweet little faces and bodies. But notice that one of them kind of seems to be getting special attention. This one over here. We notice that God's other hand is resting with this sort of unusual gesture on that baby's shoulder. So one interpretation of this painting is that with one hand, God is creating man, creating original sin. And with his other hand, he is creating Jesus, who would be the salvation, the redemption for that sin. Now, that is pretty powerful storytelling. Sometimes this figure here is interpreted as Eve. Sometimes she's thought of as the Virgin Mary. But this is such an iconic moment and such a great composition, such great storytelling, that it makes sense that other people have adopted it to tell their stories, right? I love this one with the Muppets because, of course, Jim Henson is like a god to these Muppets. He's created all of them. And that sort of potential, that moment of connection, or where we're about to see that connection, is literally Jim Henson bringing these characters to life in the same way. This is just a great photograph over here at the bottom by a photographer named Freddie Fabrice. He did a series of photographs of mechanics adopting all of these poses from great Renaissance and Baroque paintings. Now, one of the last, I think, really compelling theories around Michelangelo's painting called The Creation of Man has to do with the shape of this drapery that is kind of swooping out beyond God here. It's a really interesting shape. You'll notice too that there's this little green trail here, and some of that sometimes that's captured in the parodies as well. Well, neuroscientists who are much more familiar with the shape of the brain have actually theorized that Michelangelo designed that kind of swooping drapery and that cluster of figures to look like the shape and the anatomy of the human brain. And wouldn't that just make such great sense? Because this is the moment where God is sort of swooping in and giving Adam knowledge. It would be a brilliant move on the part of Michelangelo. And you might be thinking, well, how did he know what a brain looked like? As a Renaissance man, he was really interested in anatomy, and without a doubt, he definitely was there for the dissection of various human bodies. So he would probably be fairly familiar with what a brain looked like. I don't think it's an outlandish theory by any stretch of the imagination. Now, one of the sketches that I love for for the creation of man is this one over here. You can see Michelangelo is in his element. He's really focused on this muscular torso of Adam over here. Adam has so many muscles. He's probably got some invented muscles that go along with this. We can see where Michelangelo's true passions lie, but we can also see in this other sketch that he was really sort of thinking through the gestures, the hands, the storytelling that came from those hands here. And, you know, what an amazing thing to think about, you know, Michelangelo never really knowing how important that gesture has been to humanity ever since, and how significant and how great it is in terms of storytelling. So we are going to move on from the Renaissance now and shift our focus from gods now to heroes. So we are going to look at Rembrandt's The Night Watch, painted in 1642. This is at the Rijksmuseum in the Netherlands. And of course, the right off the bat, the famous story around this particular picture is that it's not a night scene, and it was never called The Night Watch. It is a painting that was heavily varnished after it was painted, and so the painting itself really darkened. But this was also kind of the style of the day to create these very shadowy paintings like this with little bright patches of color here. So it has an official title that refers to the specific men who are kind of leading this militia troop here. But generally speaking, everybody calls it The Night Watch. Now, this is a very large painting. It's about 12 feet tall and 14 feet wide. These figures are roughly life-size too. And there's about 24 of them here. And there's a lot of chaos. But before I get into the chaos, what I wanted to do was just highlight the fact that this was a revolutionary way for Rembrandt or any artist to portray one of these militia style groups that were pretty popular in Amsterdam at the time. There were all these different groups, and they all had their own kind of meeting houses, and they would all pay to get their portraits done. And typically when they did this, it was like school picture day. They'd all pay the same amount of money, and the artist would just have them line up and paint their different heads. Look at this. It almost looks like they're all wearing the same outfit. It doesn't matter what they're wearing. Just get the faces in and make it really clear. Of course, Rembrandt is doing something revolutionary in that he decides, instead of lining them up and making a boring painting, he's going to transform this portrait into like a grand history painting. This is going to be a call to arms, but it turns out to be sort of like a mishmash, chaotic call to arms, because he's dressing all of these figures and arming them with just random props that he had around his studio. So, I mean, if you were really trying to zero in on costumes and armor and spears and muskets, you would be thinking, what time period is this? What on earth is going on? The more you look at it, the more you begin to wonder about what's happening here. And I remember back in grad school, I took a semester-long course on Rembrandt, and I just remember reading about this work and coming away from the reading with so many more questions than I had than at the beginning of the reading. It just sort of pulled at all of these different threads, and you just begin to wonder. But one of my lasting questions really had to do with this little golden girl over here. You can see up close, she's got a dead chicken hanging from its talons, tied to her waist here. For years, art historians debated who she was, why she was there. Was she an imagined figure? Generally speaking, they think of her as like a representation of a mascot. I was telling my brother about this the other day, and he sort of furrows his brow. He doesn't really understand. So I put it to him in terms he could understand. I said, it's like she's Ravenclaw, and she's got the claws right there to prove it. So she's the stand-in, and that made sense. So there's another detail of this picture that I absolutely love. There is a purported self-portrait of Rembrandt in this picture, and it's hysterical. Are you ready for this? It is believed that right back here, almost, near the center of the picture, that there's this little eyeball, and that eyeball belongs to Rembrandt. And you can see that he's wearing this little cap that looks like other caps that he's worn in self-portraits. I believe this is one of the self-portraits that was stolen from the Gardner Museum down here. But you can see similar hat, similar eyeball. It's so funny to me to think that Rembrandt just had to like tuck himself into this great painting here too. Some more fun facts related to the Night Watch. When this picture left the meeting house where this militia group would meet and then eventually moved into a museum, it was too big to fit out the door or maybe into the museum door. So they did something, just unbelievable. They altered the painting and not the architecture. So Rembrandt's Night Watch has actually been cut down over the years. A huge portion of it is missing from over here on the left. How do we know that? Because once again, there were some great copyists along the way that showed us what the painting was intended to look like. Now, Rembrandt's Night Watch is like a fan favorite. When you go to the Rijksmuseum, that's where the crowds are. It's like visiting the Mona Lisa at the Louvre. But it also attracts negative behavior. Over the years, the painting's been attacked several times with like knives and other things, even acid. Amazingly, there were guards in the room that were able to neutralize the acid almost immediately. But there's been so many attacks over the years that the Rijksmuseum actually installed a trap door underneath this giant painting so that if it was ever in danger, it could just fall off the wall, through the floor, and into a chute to protect it. That is pretty incredible. So we're going to shift now to our last hero, and it's one that we are much more familiar with than any of these Europeans that we've seen so far tonight. It is, of course, Washington crossing the Delaware. We've got these great parodies of it with the cast of Veep over here, with Julia Louis-Dreyfus looking a little bit spaced out here, unaware of people outside of the boat. And then Stephen Colbert and his staff adopting the same poses. Now, the actual painting, of course, looks like this, and we all could have probably assembled ourselves in a similar pose because this is a painting that's so familiar to so many of us. I think at this point, we almost think of it as gospel, like it's an actual depiction of Washington crossing the Delaware during the Revolutionary War. Now, nothing could be further from the truth. Of course, this was painted by a German artist, and it was painted much closer in time to the Civil War than to the Revolutionary War. But you can imagine paintings that provide some sort of sense of unity would have been a hot commodity as we geared up towards the Civil War. So this painting is in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And just as I mentioned before, everybody loves it. People like to adopt these different poses. The only people that don't like it, apparently, are the curators of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. There's a lot of problems with this painting. I'll touch on a few of them, but they consider it sort of a second-rate painting, but it's always on view, in part because it's a crowd favorite and also in part because it's absolutely enormous. And so it creates problems to store it. So why not just leave it out? So let's talk a little bit about what's going on in this picture. We all know George Washington is standing there in this kind of triumphant pose. I think there's some sort of character from like a liquor ad that, you know, adopts a similar pose as that, but this is a triumphant pose, make no mistake. And it's probably not the way that any of us would choose to stand in a boat. So they are crossing the Delaware to attack the Hessians in New Jersey on Christmas night. Now, one of the first problems here is that it was a snowstorm when they did this. It wasn't like the cloud breaking through the cloud, or the sun breaking through the clouds here. It was driving snow. So that's one inaccuracy. The other inaccuracy here is the ice in the water. Have you ever seen ice that's all jagged like this? This is not how rivers freeze in the Northeast in America. This is how rivers freeze in Germany. This is what the Rhine looks like. So we have the artist painting what he knows essentially here. We also have the issue of multiple light sources. We can see what looks like a sun over here, but then like beams of light coming down over here on the right. We also have right at the center a completely inaccurate flag, a flag that did not exist at the time of the revolution. Details, right? Just details. And then we have this, fascinating collection of figures in the boat. So how do we make sense of them? What's going on there? Well, to his credit, Emanuel Leutze is giving us this fascinating cross section of America through his understanding of America. So we have at the forefront of I don't know boat terms. At the front of the boat, we have a figure who's got an animal skin cap. He sort of looks like a frontiersman. The figure alongside him is wearing a Scottish bonnet, and right next to him is an African American. If we move towards the back of the boat, we have a Native American figure here, a couple of farmer types, one of them with a bandaged head. And then this is fascinating to me. This figure here in red is oftentimes interpreted or understood to be a female figure in male clothes. So imagine someone who's like so desperate to support the war effort that they would change their identity so that they could participate in the war. We have a couple of generals in here, another frontiersman. This is actually future President Monroe who is supporting the flag here. So we've got a good sense in terms of who the people are and what the inaccuracies are. If you're like really dedicated to historical accuracy, they actually restage the crossing every year, I think, on Christmas. So, I mean, we can just get down to New Jersey to see it if we're that desperate for the facts there. So just to kind of wrap up on this particular hero, what's fascinating to me is that there was a smaller version of this painting made by Emanuel Leutze. It was sold at auction for, just a couple of years ago. And you might think, wow, this is an American icon. It must have gone for hundreds of millions of dollars, like a Van Gogh or something. It sold for a measly $43 million. So it's interesting to sort of see where these things are, how they're assessed by the art world as opposed to the general public. It's like Rotten Tomatoes and the critics score and then the audience score. So let's turn our attention now with our last 15 minutes or so to some imagined spaces. And I might have to start talking even faster. We're going to start off with an altarpiece. And when I say altarpiece, I mean a painting with hinged panels that can sort of open and close like the shutters on a window. This is an altarpiece called the Garden of Earthly Delights. We're looking at it with the shutters closed. It was painted by an artist named Hieronymus Bosch right around the year 1500. Now, when altarpieces are closed, they tend to have a grayscale painting on the exterior. And in this case, we're looking at an orb that kind of looks like the Earth, but almost like a snow globe version of the Earth, like a flat Earth with a dome over it. This is God up here making two statements about the creation of the world. I think it's like the second day and the third day up here. And then what we see inside doesn't really make a lot of sense. It doesn't really help to prepare us for what we're going to see inside, because when you open up this altarpiece, it is nothing but technicolor, and it's also huge. It's about 6 feet tall and over 12 feet wide. This is a picture that overwhelms you. And what is it a picture about? Well, it's really about naughty behavior. It is about sin. And you might be thinking, weren't altarpieces made for churches? Was this in a church? No, Bosch was most certainly created this for a private client who probably had very specific tastes, if you know what I mean. So let's sort of delve into understanding what this picture is about very quickly. We've got our 3 panels and we read them from left to right. The center panel is always the most important. It's the showstopper. But when it comes to depictions of hell, which we see over here on the right, that is where Bosch really let his imagination run wild, and he was known for his just crazy depictions of the afterlife. So let's get started with the creation, and we'll move our way over to hell. So we have God over here at front and center creating Adam and Eve. We can always spot them because they're nude. Let's focus on them for just a second. And in Eden, we can see a couple of things right off the bat that look recognizable. Eden's filled with creatures. We've got an elephant over here, a giraffe with a long, slender neck up above. But as we get closer, things get stranger. There are all these creatures just in front of Adam and Eve, some like a bird with two heads here, this kind of seal with a unicorn horn. I don't know, maybe that's what narwhals actually look like. And then just strange combinations of different kinds of animals. Now notice the bodies here, notice the way the landscape is described. There's something really sort of appealing about this, but we are a world away from Michelangelo and his depiction of the creation of man. And there's only about 10 years that separate these two paintings. It's pretty amazing. So just above this little scene here with our figures, we can see there's all of these creatures kind of coming out of the water onto land. I'm going to move up there just for a moment, and you can see, again, Bosch is letting his imagination run wild. These are not real creatures. We don't have like three-headed lizards like this. Now, if I zoom out again, just for a moment, I want to give you a sort of a mind-blowing fact here. That little passage with those creatures walking out onto land is oftentimes understood to look like the profile of a figure. Here would be the nose. This would be like a closed eye with eyelashes, some lips over here. And so it might not come as a huge surprise that the surrealist artist Salvador Dali was fascinated by this what seems to be a profile in this painting, and adopted something similar as his own self-portrait for several of his paintings in the 1930s. We'll get back to that a little bit later, actually. So let's move our attention over to the Garden of Earthly Delights. This is where all the delighting is happening, right? So this is a chaotic scene filled with dozens and dozens of human figures who are doing all sorts of interesting and naughty things with large pieces of fruit and very large birds and sometimes fish. But it looks like everything is sort of all of these encounters are of a romantic or of a sexual nature. There's very strange pairings of figures and fruit. But one element that you see a couple of times in this picture are figures that are enclosed in these little bubbles. And artists at the time oftentimes painted proverbs being things like "don't bite the hand that feeds you," and they would paint literal depictions of these things. So some scholars theorize that these bubbles are a suggestion of a proverb that existed at the time, something similar to like happiness is as fragile as a bubble or as fragile as glass. We can see a lot of these strange combinations here. Around the foreground of the picture, we see clusters of figures eating fruit, communing with fruit and birds all around. In the middle ground, we have this pool of water where there are women bathing and standing, and then this parade of men on the backs of real and imagined creatures they seem to be kind of performing for, trying to impress the women. Some of them are in very strange positions. And then even further back in this one panel, sorry, I went the wrong way, we have mountains and fountains that all look vaguely phallic. And once again, very strange combinations of things and people. I love this group that seems to be emerging from the water into a giant broken egg. None of it makes sense, but we all know that you're going to end up in hell in the afterlife. So there's a lot to unpack here. I'm just going to focus on a couple of fantastic details, including this figure here that is generally understood to be the devil in this picture. Traditionally speaking, in art history, the devil was blue, not red. Here, he has a bird head and he's wearing a cauldron for a hat. He is ingesting and excreting human beings. We are just beginning to imagine how bad hell can be. But one of the very imaginative things that Hieronymus Bosch does with this painting is he does this whole vignette here of human beings being tortured in the afterlife by musical instruments. So musical instruments become instruments of torture. We can see a figure who is trapped inside a drum and there's a monster beating on it. You thought your kid practicing drums in the garage was annoying? Imagine living in that drum. Over here, we've got a figure who's impaled on the strings of a harp. Imagine what it would feel like to have the vibrations of those strings going through your body. I don't even know how you come up with something like that. But then the one last really fun and bizarre fact here is this rear end with the music on it. Now, only recently did somebody actually translate these musical notes to musical instruments. And what's really fun is that you can go right on YouTube and listen to this song. I just put a link to the YouTube video in the chat. It is a disturbing song. Apparently, Bosch knew how to write music, or he had friends that did. So as we close those shutters to this painting, we once again see God and the orb of the earth here, going back to that notion of happiness being fragile as glass or a bubble. Another interpretation is that this is a depiction of the flood and God is washing away all that sin. So we've got one fantastic imagined space that's sort of knocked out here. I want to move on to the most well, probably the most recognizable image in Western art these days. I think my kids know Starry Night better than the Mona Lisa. This is, of course, the painting by Vincent van Gogh done in 1889. It's in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. And I think part of the public's fascination with this painting is because we're fascinated by Vincent van Gogh. We're fascinated by the fact that he severed his ear and that he painted this work, this iconic painting, while he was living in an insane asylum. So so there's a lot to unpack here, but let's just sort of review that biography there. This beautiful landscape here that's dominated by these blues and lavenders, this little landscape that takes our eye through this town to this church that seems to have a steeple that pierces the sky here, and then this unbelievable rolling and roiling night sky. Well, here is Vincent van Gogh just a few weeks really after he severed his ear, wearing a bandage over his ear and a hat and a coat, essentially trying to tell his doctors that he's taking good care of himself. He's even got his easel in the background and one of his beloved Japanese prints. But he wasn't really able to take good care of himself. In fact, his neighbors, about 30 of them, signed a petition to get him out of the neighborhood. That's how erratic his behavior was. So his brother paid for him to go to an asylum. And it was actually, I mean, we have sort of negative connotations with the word asylum, but this was actually a pretty nice place for Vincent van Gogh to be. We are looking at the actual room that he lived in at this asylum, and he had a surprising amount of freedom while he was there. This is an image that he created from inside with the door of the asylum open. He had the freedom to move in and out and all around the property there. When he first arrived, he was in rough shape, and he began painting his famous irises painting. He worked on it for 2 weeks straight, which is like probably 6 times as long as any painting that he ever worked on. But he called this painting a lightning rod for his mental illness. And he felt like if he just kept working on it, it would keep him steady, keep him going in the right direction. And for the most part, about 75% of the time, that's how he was when he was at the asylum. He had his own studio space separate from his bedroom. And so he could work as much as he wanted to or needed to. Of course, there were dark times too, where he was ingesting his own paint and even paint thinner. But for the most part, he was doing all right. And it was there that he created this incredible work. I think part of the fascination with this painting is that people feel like they're seeing the world through the eyes of a quote unquote madman, but this is not his vision as he was looking out the window. He wasn't painting it at night in his bedroom. Instead, he's downstairs working during the day in his studio, and he worked on this over several days. So we don't think of it as a direct observation of the space where he was living. In fact, this is a photograph of roughly that same landscape. You don't see the rolling hills in the background. There's that church. Obviously, the steeple is much taller and pointier in Van Gogh's painting, and it even has a dome behind it, which he omits. So it's not exactly the same thing. He's not going for a specific realistic depiction here, but he was perhaps influenced by a couple of things from the outside world. We know that there were already published images of spiral galleries or galaxies, I should say, going back to the 1850s. And while he was living in Paris, there's a pretty good chance that he saw images like this. And that's probably why we have this incredible spiral or knot right here at the center of the painting. We know that he loved Japanese woodblock prints, and so the famous Great Wave no doubt played or had some influence in terms of his composition here. I would be remiss too if I didn't mention this very tall framing device in his painting. This is a cypress tree. They are closely associated with death in the history of art. They're often planted in cemeteries. In this case, it's very close to us in the foreground, which is why it looms so large. Now, there's been kind of wild interpretations of this painting over the years. One of the ones that I read recently, which kind of knocked my socks off because it's wild. And this was by a renowned art historian who said that there's actually a pregnant woman in the sky and that the moon is her crown, and then you guess where her body is down below. But I really think that that Van Gogh was experimenting with brushwork. He was experimenting with color theory here, with these yellows and blues sort of being opposite each other on the color wheel. And in fact, he didn't think that this was a great painting when he was done with it. He wrote to his brother that it was a little bit of a flop. These days, of course, everyone disagrees. And the Museum of Modern Art has made it on their website so that you can essentially rotate the canvas around in real time and get really close to it like this and see how he was actually applying the paint to the canvas here, which is so exciting. So with this painting, Vincent van Gogh essentially establishes this idea that a landscape can be emotional. Without Vincent van Gogh, we probably wouldn't have Munch's The Scream that we see over here on the right from just a few years later, which incidentally, I believe, is the only painting that is also an emoji. We're going to finish up tonight with one last painting, and we all know it, even if you don't know the exact title. All I have to say is Melting Clocks, and we all sort of lock into this image. This is a landscape that also evokes very strong feelings. For me, it's feelings of disgust, and I think that's sort of what Salvador Dali was going for when he painted The Persistence of Memory in 1931. This is also at the Museum of Modern Art. It's a much smaller painting than most of the paintings that we've looked at tonight. It's about 10 inches by 14 inches. So part of the fascination with this painting is that Salvador Dali, who we see over here in a photograph taken just a few years after the painting was done, was that he was a showman. And as a surrealist artist, he was very interested in tapping into the unconscious. He was interested in Freud. So they were sort of using the terms unconscious and subconscious as synonyms. So he's trying to tap into this part of our minds that we're not even fully aware of. And what does that breed? What does that look like visually? So Salvador Dali said that he could put himself into a trance, essentially, and then paint what he saw. So sort of like Hieronymus Bosch, who we saw before, remember that little profile that we saw in the Garden of Earthly Delights? Well, Dali put a similar profile that's presumed to be a self-portrait right there in the center of The Persistence of Memory. So sort of like Bosch, who came before him, Salvador Dali got really good at just combining disparate things. So what you have in his paintings is something that looks crystal clear. We can understand that we're looking at a dead tree. We understand that we're looking at a watch, but it's also illogical. And so that functions so much like a dream that we might have, which I think is part of the appeal here. Most art historians are pretty critical or skeptical about his so-called approach to making art, but it has some staying power. I think everyone is kind of fascinated by this work. Now, just to break it down, the landscape here in the background with these hills, and then there's some water here. This was inspired by Catalonia, Spain, which is where Salvador Dali was born and raised. Over here on the right and over the self-portrait of Dali, we have the famous melting clocks. He was asked at some point, were these clocks inspired by Einstein's theory of relativity? And he said, no, I was just looking at some wheels of cheese basically melting on a hot day. So he's playing with our concept of what is hard and what is soft here. And he's also sort of playing with our concept of what is organic and what isn't. He's got this cluster of ants on the back of this pocket watch over here on the far left that suggest death and suggest decay. Right alongside it is another clock that has another bug on it. And if we zoom in, we can see that it is just one solitary fly. In this case, I think it's just a play on words. it's time flies, right? It's a little bit silly. So so this painting created waves from the second it was first exhibited. A critic at the time proclaimed it to be 10 by 14 inches of Dali dynamite, and it was reproduced basically in every review of that show. But what most people don't know is that there's another version of it. Salvador Dali returned to the persistence of memory about 2 decades later with this work, which is called The Disintegration of the Persistence of Memory. It just rolls right off the tongue. And generally speaking, this work is understood to be a little bit of a meditation on the artist's anxieties related to the atomic age. So he's kind of atomized all of the elements of the foreground, those big stage-like blocks that we saw before. There are these other abstract elements that kind of look like warheads. They seem to be circling around time here as well. And his self-portrait, his blob self-portrait here seems to be kind of echoing the way this fish is decorated here too. And Dali did say that the fish was supposed to represent life. So not sure if he's getting more lively over here or if he is going to disintegrate as well. Now, Dali, as a showman, really knew how to make a buck, and he made a career on these melting clocks. So these 3 works, this is a sculpture, this is a tapestry, these are playing cards. These are all from the 1970s. He was cashing in on this motif for decades. It was so popular and I think so compelling to us as well. And we still sort of play with this concept of time shifting and time being a flat circle, if you know the reference there, in popular culture, in literature all the time. So we'll end with just one last parody here. We've got 2 Simpsons parodies of The Persistence of Memory, where the characters are sort of the blobs here. The donut is attracting the bugs, but you just gotta love Salvador's deli, The Persistence of Lunchtime, with the melting clock in the background. So our quick conclusion here, just our big ideas, very similar to with part 1 too. This idea that a little bit of mystery about a work of art can go a long way, because these works can sort of change with us as a civilization, as a culture, as we change and evolve. And I think the other big idea is that we are so attracted to anything that's beautiful, anything that's compelling, whether it's the spiral curls that we see over here with our Venus, or the spiral galaxies that might be hovering up here in Van Gogh's The Starry Night. There's always something that brings us back and makes us wonder. So I will end there for now, and I will start looking at some of the questions in the chat here and in the Q&A. Please feel free to keep those coming, and I'll do my best now to answer them. Elena says, in Washington Crossing the Delaware, why was the figure in red thought to be a woman? Did they think that the face or hands as feminine, or does the issue of gender politics impact art analysis? Elena, that is a great question. I had that question myself, but I didn't delve into the answer, or I haven't yet. I'm not sure when art historians began to question the gender of that figure, or begin to think of it differently. And honestly, I'm not sure what elements prompted that, but generally speaking, in every sort of criticism, contemporary criticism, or that you read about the picture, this figure is often interpreted to be a woman, or potentially a woman. But you bring up really kind of the thorny elements around that, and how much of that is informed by current discussions really in our culture today. Thank you for raising that, and I'll do my best to try and nail down that issue a little bit better. Karen asks, interesting tidbit, or shares an interesting tidbit. There was a famous woman from Massachusetts who joined the Revolutionary Woman as a man. An amazing story, Deborah Sampson. Well, maybe Sampson was our inspiration here. She scouted out territory for Washington to use to camp out and assess what the British were doing. But I've never heard that she crossed the Delaware with him. Karen, thank you so much for sharing that. Okay, so that Karen's done all the hard work for me on this one. Thank you, Karen. Paula asks, what is the structure in front of the Starry Night painting? I might have answered that. I think maybe, Paula, you were asking about the cypress tree. Otherwise, the other structures here are just like little town buildings, but this would be this giant flame-like cypress tree over here in the front. Carmen asked, would you say that Venus was painted in a Mannerist style? Great question. Okay, so Mannerism, as an art style, is really something that came just in after the High Renaissance. So there's a lot of Mannerist elements to it, all of these exaggerations that we see, those collapsed shoulders, the long neck, all of it. But I don't think it quite fits into Mannerism per se, but it has these Mannerist elements to it. I think you could make that case, but I don't think Mannerism really existed at the time that Botticelli was doing this. So what we might think of as being Mannerist might have been him maybe missing the mark when it comes to anatomy. Maybe that's me being a little bit cruel to Botticelli, but that's a great question, Carmen. Let's see here in the chat. Let's see. Looks like, okay, so it looks like Gianna was able to share the Bosch the Bosch butt music from YouTube, which I hope some of you have had the chance to listen to because it is haunting. And Maureen says, thank you. Thank you, Maureen, for coming tonight. Denise asks, can you repeat the name of the artist? His name was Emanuel Leutze. And so he was a German artist. Yeah. And oh, that was filled in. Thank you. Thank you, Gianna, for that. So I think maybe we've gotten to all of our questions, unless there's anything else that people are burning to learn more about. Laura says, do you know how art historians overall see the restoration of the Last Supper? Great question, Laura. Actually, I think for the most part, people are pretty happy, like thinking, you know, if we can see essentially 20% of what Da Vinci painted by way of this restoration, it's better than seeing nothing at all. So, which is where it was headed, certainly. So, it's a little bit different than Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel that was also kind of heavily restored. That wasn't in as bad a shape, but Da Vinci's painting really could have been lost. So I think there's less harsh criticism about that restoration, as I understand it. Karen, thank you for your kind words, and you too, Karen. And Donnie says, oh, kind things as well. Thank you, Donnie. I really appreciate it. And thank you again, everybody, for joining us tonight. And I hope you can reconnect with us next month for Basquiat. That will be really fun. Very different, a contemporary artist, right in there with Andy Warhol. So there's that'll be some fun flashbacks to the 1980s for a lot of people. So thank you again, everybody. Thank you, Gianna.
No, thank you so much, Jane. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Thank you for your questions. Very interesting talk. So happy that I could be here for it tonight. Just so that everyone knows before you log off, once again, the next program of Art on Thursdays is going to be on February 23rd. So feel free to go to our website. You can register for that, get your Zoom link, and join us next time. And just to reiterate too, you'll get a recording of tonight's program as well as a recording of part 1. So you didn't miss out on anything. You'll get that all tomorrow. So have a good night, everyone. And thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks. Good night,
All
everyone.
right. Thanks, Jane. Good night.
Good night.